One of the most important business biographies ever written is Paul Allen's Idea Man, combined with James Wallace's Hard Drive and Bill Gates' own essays from The Road Ahead. When you read them together, which I've done more times than I can count, single, unavoidable truth becomes crystal clear. Bill Gates did not become Bill Gates because he was the smartest person in the room. He became Bill Gates because he could focus longer, think deeper, and apply discipline with a level of intensity that simply crushed his competition. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe, because every week we dissect the minds of history's most relentless builders and extract lessons you and I can actually use in our work and life. Now, here's why Bill Gates is so fascinating. The public version of him, the sweater-wearing philanthropist, the calm thinker, the podcast guest is real, but it is not the version that built Microsoft. The real Gates, the one who changed the world before he turned 30, he was sharp-edged, impatient, ruthlessly logical, and capable of levels of concentration that bordered on superhuman. And to understand how he built an empire, you have to go back to his childhood in Seattle, where the seeds of that discipline first appear. Gates grew up in a home filled with books, debates, high expectations, and a mother who ran community boards like military operations. But the real turning point wasn't the environment. It was the moment his parents bought a terminal timeshare subscription at the University of Washington. Gates was 13. Most kids flirted with hobbies. Gates found an addiction. He immersed himself in code the way other kids immerse themselves in sports. Hours vanished. Meals disappeared. Teachers complained. His mother worried. But Gates wasn't rebellious. He was consumed. Paul Allen later wrote that watching Teenage Gates' program was like watching someone fall into a trance. He would stare at the screen with absolute stillness, blinking maybe once every 30 seconds, disappearing into a mental tunnel so deep that the outside world simply ceased to exist. This is where you first see the pattern that defines his entire life. Disciplined obsession. Gates didn't dabble. He didn't try something just to see. He committed fully, often at the cost of everything else. There's a story in Hard Drive where Gates becomes so absorbed writing code that he forgets to sleep for 2 days. Not intentionally, he simply never noticed time passing. By the time he arrives at Harvard at 17, his brain is already operating at a level most people never reach. He attends classes sporadically, but when he does, he dominates the room. He reads textbooks in a single night. He solves problems professors expect to take weeks. But Harvard is not the main story. Harvard is the place where focus meets opportunity, because this is where Paul Allen walks into Bill's dorm room holding the magazine with the Altair 8800 on the cover. And in that moment, a moment Gates later called the most important pivot of his life, his operating system locks onto a single conclusion. The personal computer revolution is coming, and whoever writes the software for it will control the future. What happens next is not luck. It is discipline. Gates drops everything, literally everything, and begins the most intense coding sprint of his life. He skips meals, skips classes, sleeps on the floor of his dorm. He and Allen write a basic interpreter in record time. And when they finally demo it to MITs in Albuquerque, Gates brings not enthusiasm, but absolute certainty. From that moment on, the story of Microsoft is the story of a young man whose ability to focus harder and longer than anyone else allowed him to outthink, outwork, and outmaneuver an entire industry. When Bill Gates and Paul Allen moved to Albuquerque to work with MITs, most people thought of them as talented kids. What they didn't realize is that Gates was already functioning like the CEO of a future global empire. He wasn't older, richer, or more experienced than anyone around him. What he had was something far more dangerous, a mind trained to apply deep focus with algorithmic precision. The stories from those early Microsoft days are almost mythological in how extreme they sound, but every biography confirms the same pattern. Gates didn't just work long hours. He operated in a state of continuous immersion. Employees recalled walking into the tiny office at 2 a.m. and finding Bill hunched over a terminal, eyes locked, fingers firing like a man decoding the universe. They'd leave, sleep, return at 10 a.m., and he would still be there in the exact same posture, unchanged, as if Chimmy didn't T apply to him. People misunderstand this. They think it's about workaholism. It wasn't. It was about the way Gates thought. He didn't toggle between tasks. He didn't check distractions. He didn't vibrate between obligations. He entered a mental tunnel and stayed there until the problem shattered. There's a famous hallway in the early Microsoft office where you could hear Gates before you saw him. He'd pace violently back and forth, rocking on his heels, swinging his arms in sharp motions, muttering calculations under his breath. That pacing, which freaked out new employees, wasn't anxiety. It was how Gates processed complex logic. While everyone else needed whiteboards, Gates ran full simulations in his head. And here's the thing that shocks people. He expected everyone else to operate at his level. This is where the deep discipline of his leadership style begins to show. Gates didn't care about age resume or politics. He cared about intellectual precision. If you showed up to a meeting unprepared, he would annihilate you not emotionally, but logically. He had a signature line that veterans still remember. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." Was it harsh? Yes. Did it break weak people? Yes. But it also forged one of the most elite engineering cultures ever assembled. What biographies reveal is that Gates wasn't mean for the sake of being mean. He was obsessed with truth. He couldn't tolerate sloppy thinking. He couldn't stand untested assumptions. He couldn't accept ambiguity unless it was mathematically justified. His discipline wasn't rigidity, it was intellectual cleanliness. And that discipline created Microsoft's greatest early advantage. Their software rarely failed. While competitors rushed half-finished products to market or leaned on hardware sales, Gates built with almost paranoid rigor. He would personally read through thousands of lines of code, scanning for inefficiencies, redundancies, or conceptual flaws. In one story, after rewriting a section of code himself, he placed the printout on a programmer's desk with a note. "I fixed it. No explanation necessary." When the company eventually moved to Seattle, Gates' intensity became even more pronounced. The team grew, the stakes grew, but Bill's behavior stayed exactly the same. He lived in a near-military rhythm: work, think, code, pace, debate, repeat. He tracked everything: competitors, price changes, licensing loopholes, market shifts, with obsessive detail. He treated the industry like a chessboard where he played 20 moves ahead, and behind this intensity was a deeper force. Focused as a weapon, Gates believed that if you concentrated fully on the right problem for long enough, reality would eventually bend. And in the personal computing revolution, he bent reality more times than anyone expected. By the time Microsoft entered its true growth phase in the early 1980s, Bill Gates had already mastered something most entrepreneurs never learn: the difference between working hard and thinking hard. Almost everyone can grind. Almost no one can sustain deep, uninterrupted cognitive discipline for years. Gates' advantage wasn't brute force effort, it was the quality of his focus. There's a moment described in Hard Drive that perfectly captures this. Microsoft had just secured a deal that would later define the personal computer industry, their partnership with IBM. Gates understood immediately what this meant. IBM was going to build the world's most important computer, and whoever controlled the operating system would control the future of software. This wasn't a product decision, it was a geopolitical one, the digital version of choosing which country would own the map. While other companies hesitated, Gates locked into a decision-making mode that biographers describe as almost unnerving. He began analyzing every possible outcome, every possible licensing deal, every possible strategic consequence. And here's where his discipline became reality shaping. He didn't sleep until he fully understood the landscape. He didn't move until he saw the entire chessboard. He didn't negotiate until he had mentally simulated every path forward. Employees said he could recall obscure clauses from 100-page contracts from memory, not because he had read them recently, but because he had absorbed them completely. That's the kind of focus we're talking about. The IBM deal became one of the most consequential agreements in tech history, and Gates navigated it with the emotional coldness of a surgeon. He structured licensing in a way that gave Microsoft the golden key of the industry: rights to sell MS-DOS to other manufacturers. Gates saw what IBM didn't: that personal computers would explode beyond a single brand. IBM assumed they would own the ecosystem. Gates quietly positioned Microsoft to own the operating system for all of them. This wasn't luck. This was deep, disciplined, strategic vision. And once the deal was signed, Gates returned to his natural habitat: the code itself. Even while running one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the world, he insisted on reviewing almost everything. He debated optimizations. He rewrote segments. He pushed his engineers brutally, not because he wanted control, but because he believed the details determined destiny. In the mid-80s, Microsoft's growth was meteoric, and Gates responded not by delegating more, but by training his mind to hold even more complexity. Witnesses describe his office filled with stacks of papers, prototypes, competitive software packages, market reports, and marked up code, and he consumed all of it. He had a photographic recall for technical details and a lawyer's precision for contracts. He wasn't multitasking, he was integrating. Bill Gates built his empire the way a mathematician solves a grand proof, step by step, logically, relentlessly. His discipline was not emotional. It wasn't motivational. It was mechanical. The discipline of someone who had conditioned his mind to operate at full intensity for as long as the mission required. And that mission was only getting bigger. As Microsoft entered the late 1980s and early 1990s, Bill Gates made a shift that almost no one noticed at the time, but every historian now points to as the defining pivot of his empire. He stopped thinking like a programmer and started thinking like an architect of the digital world. Still obsessive, still razor sharp, still the same relentless force of concentration, but now operating at a higher altitude. The discipline didn't leave, it evolved. This is when Gates developed one of his most powerful rituals, the Think Week. And if you want to understand why Microsoft dominated the software industry for decades, you have to understand what Think Week actually was, because it wasn't a vacation and it wasn't meditation. It was the purest expression of his deep, focused mind. Twice a year, Gates would disappear into a cabin in the Pacific Northwest with a stack of documents that sometimes weighed more than he did. Hundreds of internal memos, competitive analyses, research reports, early product ideas, wild experiments from Microsoft engineers, everything the company was working on or might one day work on. And he read every single page, new assistants, no meetings, no interruptions, no noise, just Gates, alone, thinking like a human supercomputer. He would sit for 12 hours a day, absorbing information, scribbling notes, connecting patterns. Out of these Think Weeks came decisions that changed the direction of the entire tech world. The shift toward the internet. Think Week, the early push into web browsers. Think Week, the vision for integrating software across servers, desktops, and networks. Think Week, this ritual shows you exactly how Gates built his empire, by combining discipline with clarity and clarity with execution. Because once Think Week ended, Gates would return to Microsoft like a laser-guided missile, focused, sharp, certain, and ready to push the entire company into whatever direction the future demanded. And when he pushed hard. Employees often joked that working for Gates felt like taking an exam every single day. He would walk into your office without warning, demand that you justify every technical decision, every line of code, every product choice. If you hesitated even slightly, he would stare at you with the intensity of someone who could see the entire failure tree branching out in real time. This wasn't intimidation for the sake of ego. It was Gates defending Microsoft against mediocrity. He knew what employees didn't, that in technology, the smallest flaw eventually becomes the biggest threat. A poorly designed protocol becomes a security hole. A sloppy piece of code becomes a stability issue. A small delay becomes a market disadvantage. Gates treated every detail like it carried the weight of the entire company, and the market responded. By the 1990s, Microsoft wasn't just big, it was inevitable. Windows dominated the desktop. Office became the universal language of work. Developers flocked to Microsoft tools. The company's gravitational pull was so strong that entire industries shaped themselves around its orbit. But here's what most people misunderstand. Microsoft didn't win because it moved fast. It won because Gates thought fast, and he never let his attention fragment. Every advantage Microsoft built came from one source: Bill Gates' ability to focus so intensely, so consistently, and so logically that he could see the present with future level clarity. And that clarity was about to collide with something even bigger: the rise of the internet and the internal crisis that nearly tore Microsoft apart. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft was sitting on top of the world demand, profitable, feared, and unchallenged. But that's precisely when discipline matters most. Success makes minds soft, comfort weakens focus. And empires fall not during war, but during peace. Bill Gates understood this better than anyone. And ironically, the biggest threat to Microsoft didn't come from IBM, Apple, or any of the usual competitors. It came from the internet, a technology Gates initially underestimated. When Netscape and the early web began gaining momentum, Gates was skeptical. He believed the PC was still the center of the universe. But here's what separates him from most titans who get disrupted. Gates did something almost no powerful CEO ever does. He admitted he was wrong and he moved with terrifying speed to correct it. This is the moment the world saw the full force of Gates' discipline. The moment he rewired Microsoft's entire strategy almost overnight. And the moment that proved his ability to focus wasn't just intense, it was adaptable. There's a famous memo from 1995 called the Internet Tidal Wave. It is one of the most important documents in the history of technology. And when you read it, you feel Gates' mind at work. Sharp, urgent, almost violently analytical. He writes with the tone of someone who has seen the future and realizes the company is dangerously behind. Employees who were there say the shift was instant. One day they were a desktop software company. The next, every project, every division, every engineer was redirected toward internet integration. Gates didn't ask for alignment, he commanded it. And this moment shows why discipline is more than routine. True discipline is the ability to shift the entire weight of your mind toward a new target without losing clarity or momentum. Gates did exactly that. He reorganized teams. He killed projects. He rewrote product strategies. He demanded new standards of speed. And he worked harder than everyone else to understand the coming shift. He didn't just course correct Microsoft, he reinvented it. Former executives described him like a general preparing for war. Meetings became sharper. Deadlines became tighter. Gates' already intense presence somehow became even more focused. He read technical RFCs, academic internet papers, early browser, source code, anything that would compress learning time. And the result was explosive. Internet Explorer didn't it took over. Windows became the backbone of the online world. Microsoft moved from potential disruption to absolute dominance. Gates' discipline had once again collided with opportunity and reshaped an entire industry. But the story doesn't stop there, because behind the scenes, while Microsoft conquered the internet frontier, Gates was wrestling with another force, the limits of his own mind. The company was growing too large, the world too complex, the responsibilities too scattered. And this is a moment when you begin to see a different version of Gates emerging, one who starts shifting from builder to strategist and eventually to something much more unexpected. As Microsoft expanded into a planetary force, its software on almost every desk in the modern world, Bill Gates began facing a challenge greater than any competitor, lawsuit, or technological shift. The challenge was internal. The same discipline and deep focused intensity that built his empire was now demanding even because here's what the biographies make painfully clear. Gates was operating at a pace no human could sustain indefinitely. His mind was still razor sharp, still relentless, still capable of consuming more information per hour than most teams could process in a week. But Microsoft had become too large, too interconnected, too politically complex for even him to manage entirely through sheer cognitive force. This is the phase where Gates begins transitioning from the wartime programmer king to something more strategic, almost philosophical. And the seeds of this transformation were visible long before he stepped down. You see it in the way he started public speaking with more clarity. You see it in how he framed long-term global issues. You see it in the way he began reading even more widely biology, agriculture, epidemiology, economics, climate science. The discipline didn't fade. It scaled. Biographers note that Gates began applying the same deep focus mindset he once used for software to understanding the world's most complicated problems. And this is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because instead of running away from complexity, he ran toward it. Disease, poverty, vaccination, logistics, global education, these weren't just charitable interests. They were systems problems, the kind that reward obsessive clarity. And Gates still had the same ability that defined him since childhood. He could stare at a problem longer than anyone else. This trait shaped Microsoft, then it reshaped the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Staff members talk about reviews that feel like the old Microsoft days. Gates pacing, firing questions, dismantling assumptions, demanding data, drilling into the core logic like a scientist with unlimited time and unlimited curiosity. The world sees his philanthropy as kindness, but insiders understand the truth. Gates is still optimizing systems. Still applying discipline to the biggest problems he can find. He doesn't believe in solving things halfway. He believes in solving them completely, and perhaps the most revealing detail comes from the people who know him best. They say Bill Gates never really turned off. Not when he stepped down as CEO, not when he shifted to philanthropy, not even now. His life is still structured around thinking with frightening intensity, still built on reading, analyzing, questioning, pacing, dissecting, simplifying, clarifying. And when you step back and look at his entire arc, the teeny programmer in a computer lab, the young founder rewriting code at 4 a.m., the CEO negotiating industry-shaping alliances, the strategist steering Microsoft through the internet tidal wave, the philanthropist tackling global health, you realize something profound. Bill Gates' empire isn't Microsoft. His empire is his mind. Microsoft was simply the first field he planted. The world became the second, and in both cases, the pattern is the same. Discipline, depth, precision, relentless focus applied to the largest possible impact. That is the operating system of Bill Gates. And that is how one person built, not just a company, but an era.